There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to the open Atlantic. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of weight, of water that runs miles deep, of wind that has crossed continents without once touching land. It is the silence of a world that does not answer to any king, any court, or any law written by men who have never left the shore. It was into this silence, in the early years of the 18th century, that a ship moved. She was enormous by the standards of her age. 40 guns ranged along her sides, heavy, iron-throated things that could splinter a hull at 300 yards and turn a deck into something no man would want to look at for very long. Her rigging climbed high and dark against whatever sky she was given, and the flags she chose to fly were not the banners of any nation. They were something else entirely, something that made the crews of other ships reach with trembling hands for their spyglasses and then wish immediately that they hadn't. She was called the Queen Anne's Revenge, and the man who commanded her had built himself, with considerable care and considerable intelligence, into something the maritime world had never quite seen before. His name, the name the world came to know him by, was Blackbeard. But let us not rush toward him. Not yet. He will arrive in his own time, and he always did have a gift for the entrance. Before Blackbeard, before the black flags and the gun smoke, this ship had lived another life entirely. She was born French, built in the late 17th century and christened La Concorde de Nantes. She was, for years, a respectable vessel in the transatlantic slave trade, a trade that was, by every measure of its age, considered ordinary commerce. She crossed the Atlantic in both directions, carrying human suffering westward and profit eastward, and the ocean asked no questions about either. Then, in the autumn of 1707, off the island of Martinique, La Concorde met something it was not equipped to meet. A pirate fleet, small but ruthless, operating under a captain who had learned his trade under one of the most successful privateers of the age, moved alongside her. The French crew, already reduced by illness and the particular cruelties of the Middle Passage, made the only calculation available to them. They surrendered. The man who accepted that surrender looked at the ship beneath his feet and understood immediately what it could become. He was Edward Teach, or Thatch. The records disagree, and he may have preferred it that way. And within weeks, he had transformed La Concorde into something the Atlantic had never carried before. He expanded her armament from roughly 16 guns to 40. He reinforced her. He gave her a new name, whether as a tribute to Queen Anne's War, or as an irony aimed at the British Crown that would never be entirely resolved. And he set her sailing under a new kind of authority. Not the authority of a nation, the authority of terror, carefully manufactured. What made the Queen Anne's Revenge remarkable was not simply her guns, though the guns were remarkable. It was the combination she represented. A ship of genuine warship capability, captained by a man who understood psychology as well as seamanship. Blackbeard had grasped something that many commanders of his era had not, that a battle won without firing was infinitely cheaper than a battle won by force. And so he constructed himself. He wove slow-burning fuses into his dark beard and lit them before engagements, so that when his face appeared through the smoke of an approach, it appeared wreathed in its own private smoke, his eyes wild and bright above it. He was tall, he was loud, he was deliberate, and the reputation he built preceded the Queen Anne's Revenge into every harbor and shipping lane she entered. Merchants struck their colors before he fired a shot. Captains wept and handed over their cargo rather than test what a 40-gun ship with a devil at the helm might do to them. It worked. For a time, it worked almost perfectly, but there is always a current running beneath the surface of these stories. Beneath the flags and the fire and the mythology, there is a man making choices about loyalty, about power, about how long any kingdom built on fear can hold together before the fear turns inward. That is what we are here to examine, not the legend, though the legend is worth knowing. The ship, the man, the world they move through, and what the sea, patient and indifferent as it always is, eventually decided to do with both of them. Settle in. This will take a little while, and it is worth every moment. Segment 2. The world that made monsters. To understand the Queen Anne's revenge, you must first understand the ocean she sailed. And to understand that ocean, you must understand the particular moment in history that produced it, because Blackbeard did not appear from nowhere. No figure of his magnitude ever does. He was, in many ways, a creation of his era, shaped by forces that had been building for decades before he was born, and that would continue long after he was gone. The early 18th century Atlantic was, by any honest accounting, a world in violent transition. For 200 years, the great European powers, England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, had been conducting a slow, brutal argument over who owned the sea. Not any particular sea. All of it. The trade routes, the shipping lanes, the island chains of the Caribbean, the coastal approaches to a new world that was producing extraordinary wealth at extraordinary human cost. Sugar, tobacco, cotton, silver from the mountains of South America, gold moving in both directions across an ocean that had become, essentially, the most contested highway in human history. Wars rose and fell over this argument. Treaties were signed. Borders were drawn on maps by men who had never visited the places they were dividing. And then, with reliable frequency, the wars began again. It was in this climate of perpetual contest that a particular institution flourished, one that would shape the man who became Blackbeard more directly than almost anything else in his life: the privateer. A privateer occupied a peculiar legal territory that the modern world has largely abandoned, and it is worth pausing here to appreciate just how strange it was. A privateer was, essentially, a pirate with paperwork. He operated a private warship. He attacked and seized other vessels. He kept a portion of whatever he captured, but he did all of this under a government-issued license called a letter of marque, which specified, at least in theory, that he was only permitted to attack the ships of enemy nations. In practice, the distinction was often academic. What the letter of marque system produced, over the course of decades, was an enormous pool of men trained in maritime violence, men who knew how to navigate, how to fight at sea, how to manage a crew under extreme conditions, how to read weather and current and the posture of an approaching sail. Men who had been paid well for their violence when it served their government's purposes, and who found themselves, when peace arrived, suddenly without employment and without any particular inclination toward the gentler trades. This is the world Edward Teach was born into. The precise year of his birth remains uncertain. Historians place it somewhere in the 60-80s, most likely in Bristol, England, though some accounts suggest he may have spent formative years in the colonies, possibly Jamaica, possibly the Carolinas. The documentary record of his early life is frustratingly thin, which is not unusual for men of his background and era. He was not, before he became Blackbeard, anyone that record keepers saw fit to follow. What we know is that by the early 1700s, he was sailing under the privateer Benjamin Hornigold, operating out of the lawless port settlement of New Providence in the Bahamas. And it was here, in this place, that the world he would come to dominate was already taking shape. New Providence in those years was something that the settled, law-abiding colonies to the north regarded with a mixture of horror and fascination that they were not always willing to admit to. It was, in the most functional sense, a pirate republic. The island sat at a strategic position in the Caribbean, close enough to the major shipping lanes that a fast sloop could intercept Atlantic traffic within hours. Its harbor was shallow enough that the large naval vessels Britain might send to pacify it could not easily follow a fleeing pirate into safe water. And it had, by the second decade of the 18th century, accumulated a population of several thousand people who had, for various reasons, decided that the jurisdiction of European kings did not apply to them. These were not, in the main, the romantic outlaws of later imagination. They were practical men and women operating a practical economy. Ships came in with captured cargo. That cargo was sold, traded, and consumed. Merchants from the colonies, respectable, church-going merchants whose names appear on no wanted poster, came to buy it because stolen goods are cheap goods, and cheap goods are good for business. The whole arrangement was mutually convenient for everyone except the original owners of the cargo, and the original owners of the cargo were, more often than not, large trading companies whose losses their shareholders absorbed without noticeable suffering. This was the air Teach breathed during his formative years as a sailor. This was the culture that taught him what power looked like and how it was maintained. And what he observed, with the quiet attentiveness that seems to have characterized him when he was not performing, was that power on the water depended on a very specific combination of force and theater. Force alone was insufficient. The ocean was too large, the hiding places too numerous, the prize too mobile. Any captain who relied purely on his guns to control his world would eventually meet a ship better armed, a crew better rested, a captain less encumbered by the reputation he was trying to protect. But theater alone was equally insufficient. A reputation had to be underwritten by genuine capability. The performance had to be credible, and credibility required a foundation of real violence, or at least the recent memory of it. What Blackbeard understood, perhaps better than any man of his age, was the ratio. How much actual force was required to make the theater convincing? How seldom, in practice, the curtain needed to fall. It was Benjamin Hornigold who gave Teach his first significant command. A small sloop, operating in consort with Hornigold's own vessel, raiding shipping in the Caribbean and along the American colonial coast. Under Hornigold's mentorship, Teach learned the mechanics of the trade. How to read a prize. How to approach without triggering panic and flight. How to manage a crew that was, by definition, composed of men who had rejected every conventional hierarchy and needed to be led by something other than rank alone. Pirate crews were, in a sociological sense, genuinely unusual organizations for their era. At a time when most of the world operated on strict hierarchies of birth and class, a pirate ship was governed by something considerably more democratic, at least in its internal arrangements. Captains were elected, shares of plunder were distributed according to agreed-upon articles that every crew member signed before sailing. The quartermaster, who managed the distribution of goods and adjudicated disputes among the crew, often held as much practical power as the captain himself. This did not make pirate ships utopian. They were violent places, governed by violent men, and the democracy extended only so far as the articles specified, and no further. But it meant that a captain needed, in addition to seamanship and ruthlessness, a quality that is sometimes underestimated in historical accounts of men like Blackbeard. He needed to be genuinely compelling. He needed to be someone that hard, experienced, dangerous men chose to follow, not because they had to, because they wanted to, because they believed that following him was more likely to result in profit and survival than any alternative available to them. Teach was apparently very good at this when the opportunity came. When the Concorde crossed his path in the autumn of 1717 and he recognized what she could be, he was ready for it in a way that years of preparation had made him ready, though he could not have planned for the specific moment. He had a crew. He had experience. He had a developing reputation. And now he had a ship that could make all of it feel, to anyone watching from the deck of an approaching prize, absolutely inevitable. He converted her rapidly. The expanded gun deck, the reinforced hull, the new name, and then he began. What followed, over the next several months, was one of the most intensive and successful piracy campaigns in the history of the Atlantic, operating first in Caribbean waters, then moving north along the American colonial coast. The Queen Anne's Revenge, and her accompanying vessels. Because Blackbeard, characteristically, did not operate alone, but at the head of a small fleet, took prize after prize. Ships laden with sugar, ships carrying provisions, merchant vessels that had the profound misfortune of finding themselves on a particular stretch of water on a particular morning when the horizon produced something that made their captain's blood run cold. By the time Blackbeard sailed north toward the Carolinas in the spring of 1718, he commanded a fleet of 4 vessels and somewhere between 300 and 400 men. He had, in less than a year, built something that the colonial authorities had no obvious mechanism for dismantling, and he was not finished. The world that had made him was also, by this point, beginning to tire of what it had made. The end of Queen Anne's War in 1713 had flooded the Atlantic with unemployed sailors and privateer captains, and the wave of piracy that resulted, what historians would come to call the Golden Age of piracy, though no one at the time was using that phrase, had begun to genuinely threaten the trade routes that the emerging Atlantic economy depended on. Merchants were being ruined. Insurance rates had climbed to levels that made certain voyages economically impossible. The colonial governors of the American seaboard were receiving increasingly impatient letters from London, asking them why, precisely, the problem was not being resolved. The answer, which none of them wanted to put in a letter, was that the problem was complicated. Some of the colonial economies had become quietly dependent on the black market that piracy supplied. Some of the governors had personal arrangements with particular captains that made aggressive action inconvenient, and some of them simply did not have the naval resources to patrol coastlines that ran for hundreds of miles through shallow, treacherous, intimately known waters. Blackbeard understood all of this. He was, the evidence suggests, a careful student of the political landscape he operated within. He knew which ports would look the other way. He knew which governors could be reasoned with and which could not. He knew that his window, the window in which a man of his capabilities could operate with relative freedom in these waters, was not going to stay open indefinitely. What he chose to do with that knowledge, and how long the window ultimately stayed open, is a story for the segments ahead. For now, it is enough to sit with the world as it was in those years. The Atlantic, enormous and dark, and perpetually in motion. The shipping lanes busy with the commerce of an expanding civilization. And somewhere in the middle distance, sails that did not belong to any nation catching the wind and moving, with unhurried purpose, toward whatever the morning had brought them. The Queen Anne's Revenge was out there, and the world had not yet found an answer to her. Segment 3. The Siege of Charleston. When a pirate held a city to ransom, there are moments in history that stop you, not because of their scale, not because armies clashed or empires fell, but because of their sheer audacity. Because somewhere a man looked at a situation that every reasonable person would have walked away from and decided with apparent calm to walk directly toward it instead. The spring of 1718 produced one of those moments. And it happened not on the open ocean, where Blackbeard's power was well established and his reputation well understood, but at the mouth of a harbor, a colonial harbor, one of the most important ports in British North America, guarded by a fort, administered by a royal governor, and considered, by everyone who had an opinion on the matter, to be firmly within the jurisdiction of the Crown. Blackbeard disagreed. Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1718, was a city of genuine consequence. It was the largest and wealthiest port in the American South, a hub of the rice and indigo trade, a place where merchant ships arrived and departed with regularity, where the docks were busy, where money moved, and where the social architecture of the colonial world was, in its own estimation, functioning more or less as intended. It sat at the confluence of the Ashley and Cooper rivers, its harbor opening eastward toward the Atlantic. Ships entering or leaving the harbor had to pass through a relatively narrow channel, and it was here, in late May of 1718, that Blackbeard positioned his fleet. 4 vessels, somewhere between 300 and 400 men, and 40 guns on the Flagship alone. He did not attack the city. He did not shell the fort or attempt any kind of land assault. What he did was considerably more elegant and considerably more unnerving. He simply sat there, at the entrance to one of the most important harbors in British America. The Queen Anne's Revenge and her consort vessels anchored themselves and waited, and whenever a ship attempted to enter or leave the port of Charleston, Blackbeard's fleet intercepted it. He held that position for approximately 1 week. In that week, he seized somewhere between 8 and 9 vessels. He took their cargo, their supplies, and, critically, their passengers as hostages. Among those passengers was a man named Samuel Wragg, a prominent merchant and member of the Colonial Council of South Carolina, along with his young son. These were not random captives. These were people whose capture sent a message that every person in Charleston could read clearly. This was not a raid. This was a siege. What Blackbeard wanted in exchange for his hostages was not gold. It was not silver. It was not the kind of plunder that a pirate fleet was conventionally understood to be after. He wanted medicine. Specifically, he sent a delegation ashore to the governor of South Carolina, a man named Charles Craven, with a demand for a chest of medical supplies, primarily mercury-based treatments that were, in the early 18th century, the standard response to syphilis, which had made itself comprehensively at home among the men of his fleet. This detail has fascinated historians for 3 centuries, and it deserves a moment of unhurried consideration, because it reveals something important about the man and the operation he ran. The demand was, in monetary terms, modest. The medical supplies Blackbeard requested were worth perhaps £300 or £400 sterling, a relatively small sum compared to the cargo value of the ships he had seized and held. What he was not after, in this instance, was maximum financial extraction. He was after something more specific. He needed to care for his men, and he was willing to hold an entire city at psychological gunpoint to get what they needed. This is not the behavior of a man driven purely by greed. It is the behavior of a commander who understood that his crew was his primary asset, that sick men were useless men, and that the health and morale of his 300 or so sailors mattered more in the practical calculus of his operation than any additional prize cargo. He looked after his people. In his fashion and by his own brutal logic, he looked after them. Governor Craven found himself in a position for which the colonial governance manuals offered very little guidance. He had no naval vessels in the harbor, capable of challenging the Queen Anne's Revenge. The fort at the harbor entrance was equipped for a rather different kind of threat than a 40-gun flagship anchored politely offshore and intercepting traffic. His hostages, respectable men, a child, were being held in conditions that the delegation Blackbeard had sent ashore described with enough specificity to communicate that their continued comfort was contingent on cooperation. He sent the medicine. The chest was prepared, loaded, and delivered. Blackbeard received it, released his hostages, apparently unharmed, though accounts suggest they were returned in a state of considerable dishevelment and psychological distress, and departed the harbor mouth with his fleet intact. The whole episode had lasted roughly a week. It had paralyzed one of the most important ports in British North America. It had demonstrated, to anyone paying attention along the colonial seaboard, that the institutions of British authority in the Americas were capable of being placed under blockade by a sufficiently equipped and sufficiently confident private captain. And it had ended not with a naval engagement, not with the defeat of the aggressor, but with the governor of South Carolina paying a ransom. London received this news poorly, but here, as with everything concerning Blackbeard, the story refuses to remain simple. Within weeks of the Charleston blockade, arguably the highest point of his power, and the most dramatic demonstration of what the Queen Anne's Revenge and her captain were capable of, everything began, quietly, and then rapidly, to change. The fleet sailed north, toward the Carolina coast, and somewhere in the waters off Beaufort Inlet, in what is now North Carolina, something happened that historians have argued about ever since. The Queen Anne's Revenge ran aground. She struck a sandbar in shallow water and could not be freed. Her hull was compromised. Her career as the most feared ship in the Western Atlantic came to an end. Not in battle, not with flags flying and guns firing, but with the slow, unglamorous settling of a great vessel into the mud of a North Carolina inlet. How this happened is one of the more interesting puzzles in the documentary record of Blackbeard's career. The charitable interpretation is simple accident. The Carolina coastline is notoriously treacherous, laced with shallow banks and shifting sandbars that have claimed vessels without any assistance from human error. Even experienced navigators came to grief in these waters, and the Queen Anne's Revenge, for all her power, was a large vessel in water that did not always have room for large vessels. The less charitable interpretation, and it is the one that a number of historians find more compelling given what followed, is that the grounding was intentional. Consider the situation Blackbeard found himself in by the summer of 1718. He commanded a fleet of 4 ships and several hundred men. That fleet needed to be fed, supplied, and kept in a state of sufficient readiness to operate. It needed a reliable base of operations. It needed, in short, a level of infrastructure and organization that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as British pressure on the pirate havens of the Caribbean intensified. The days of New Providence as a safe harbor were numbered. A new governor, Woodes Rogers, was already en route to the Bahamas with a mandate and naval support to pacify the island, and the word had reached the pirate networks of the Atlantic well in advance of his arrival. Furthermore, Britain had recently extended a general pardon to pirates willing to surrender and reform. It was not the first such pardon, and it would not be the last, but the terms being offered in 1718 were considered more generous than previous iterations, and a number of significant pirate captains had already taken the crown up on its offer. There is considerable evidence that Blackbeard was, by this point, thinking about his own future in similarly pragmatic terms. If you ground your largest, most expensive, most conspicuous vessel, the one that every naval officer from Virginia to Barbados is under orders to locate and destroy, you immediately become a smaller, faster, more manageable problem. You reduce your crew to a number you can actually sustain. You shed the logistical burden of a 40-gun warship, and you position yourself, perhaps, for a conversation with the colonial authorities that might result in something other than a noose. The men who were left behind when the Queen Anne's Revenge grounded, the ones who were not selected for Blackbeard's reduced continuing crew, would have had strong opinions about this theory. There were hundreds of them, suddenly stranded on the Carolina coast with a damaged ship and very limited options. But strong opinions held by stranded pirates are not, historically, opinions that receive a great deal of institutional sympathy. What followed the grounding was, on its surface, exactly what the pardon framework was designed to produce. Blackbeard sailed, with a much smaller vessel and a much reduced crew, to Bathtown in North Carolina, where he presented himself to the colonial governor Charles Eden and accepted the terms of the royal pardon. He was, on paper, a reformed man. He received formal amnesty for his crimes. He was, for a brief period, a legal resident of the North Carolina colony, a man of some local notoriety but no current outstanding warrants. He even, by some accounts, got married. His 14th wife, if the more colourful historical tallies are to be believed, though the documentary evidence for most of the previous 13 is thin enough to suggest that the number owes something to legend. But the retirement did not take. It very rarely did, with men of his temperament and capability in a world that had very little legal use for what they were best at. Within months, he was operating again, smaller scale than before, but operating. A sloop called the Adventure now served as his primary vessel, and if she lacked the magnificent, terrifying presence of the Queen Anne's Revenge, she was at least manageable, fast, and capable of the coastal raiding that kept his remaining crew in funds. The colonial governors of Virginia and South Carolina were not comforted by the relative reduction in scale. If anything, the persistence of the problem after a formal pardon had been issued and accepted made them angrier. It made the pardon system look like what, in practice, it often was. A temporary inconvenience for the men it was designed to neutralize, rather than a genuine solution. Virginia's Governor Alexander Spotswood, in particular, was developing a response that would be rather more definitive than a chest of medicine and a formal document. But that resolution, the final act of the Queen Anne's Revenge story, the battle at Ocracoke, and the morning that ended Blackbeard's world, belongs to a later segment. For now, sit with the image of that great ship settling into the mud of Beaufort Inlet. The guns silent, the rigging slack. The flag, whatever flag she flew that morning, hanging without wind. She had blockaded a city. She had held a governor to ransom. She had made the most powerful naval empire in the world look, briefly and humiliatingly, like it did not know what to do. And now she was still. The sea moved around her. The Carolina coast went about its business. And somewhere nearby, the man who had commanded her was already making new calculations. He always was. Segment 4. The shore he could not stay on. There is a particular kind of restlessness that belongs to men who have lived too long at speed. Men who have operated at the edge of everything, at the edge of the law, at the edge of violence, at the edge of the known world, and who find, when they finally step onto solid ground and attempt the ordinary rhythms of ordinary life, that the ground itself feels wrong beneath them, too still, too predictable, too governed by the slow, patient logic of people who have never had to decide anything quickly. Blackbeard stepped ashore at Bathtown, North Carolina, in the summer of 1718, and the ground felt wrong immediately. You can sense it in the historical record, if you read it slowly enough. Not in any single document, not in any confession or private letter. Men like Blackbeard did not write private letters, or if they did, none survived, but in the shape of what happened next, in the brevity of the retirement, in the speed with which the old patterns reasserted themselves, in the particular quality of the peace he tried to make with a world that had been, for the previous several years, entirely organized around his disruption of it. He tried. There is evidence that he genuinely tried, and that trying, and its failure, tells us something about the era he inhabited that no amount of gun counts or prize tallies quite captures. Bathtown in 1718 was not a large settlement. It was, in fact, the oldest incorporated town in North Carolina, which sounds more impressive than it was. The colony itself was young, thinly populated, and operating at a considerable remove from the centers of British Atlantic power. The town sat on the Pamlico River, accessible from the coast but sheltered enough to feel, at least marginally, like a place where a man might conduct himself quietly if he chose to. The governor of North Carolina at this time was a man named Charles Eden, and the relationship between Eden and Blackbeard is one of the more absorbing subtexts of this entire story. Eden was not, by the accounts that survive, a corrupt man in any simple sense. He was a colonial administrator operating in a colony that was genuinely difficult to govern, underfunded, understaffed, positioned at the edge of the established colonial order, and dependent on economic activity that did not always bear close examination. The North Carolina economy of this period had developed what might charitably be called a permissive relationship with the goods that moved through its ports and inlets. Eden accepted Blackbeard's pardon application. He administered the necessary oaths, and then, by the evidence of what followed, he maintained what can only be described as a working relationship with the man, one that involved a certain amount of deliberate curiosity about how Blackbeard continued to sustain himself financially in the months after his supposed retirement. The colonial secretary, Tobias Knight, was reportedly even more directly involved, allegedly receiving a portion of the proceeds from at least one vessel that Blackbeard seized during his period of nominal retirement. The documents that survive from this period are fragmentary and contested, and it is worth being careful about drawing conclusions too firmly. But the broad shape of the arrangement is not seriously disputed. Blackbeard, in his Bathtown period, operated with the knowledge and at least the tacit approval of the men nominally responsible for enforcing the law in North Carolina. This was not unusual. It was, in many ways, simply the colonial system functioning as it actually functioned, as opposed to how it described itself in official correspondence to London. What Blackbeard's life looked like during this period, on a day-to-day basis, is something historians have pieced together from court records, depositions, and the accounts of contemporaries that were committed to paper after his death, when it became safe to remember things that had previously been safer to forget. He lived in a house. He appears to have entertained with some regularity, and the entertainments were reportedly notable for their scale and their duration. The image that emerges from these accounts is of a man performing a version of settled respectability with the same deliberate theatricality he had brought to his pirate persona, hosting dinners, accepting visitors, presenting himself as a man of local consequence whose past was, formally speaking, forgiven and therefore no longer relevant. He was not very convincing, not because his manners were poor or his hospitality inadequate, but because the community around him was not composed of people who had forgotten what he was. They knew. Everyone on that coast knew. The ships he had taken, the harbor he had blockaded, the hostages he had held. These were not distant rumors in North Carolina. They were recent events discussed by people who had direct connections to the affected parties, and the presence of Blackbeard in Bathtown, formally pardoned and technically legal, created a particular social tension that no amount of dinner parties could entirely dissolve. There was also the matter of his crew, the men who had stayed with him through the grounding of the Queen Anne's Revenge. The reduced band who had followed him into this experiment with retirement were not men who adapted easily to shore life either. They needed income, they needed occupation, they needed, in the most practical sense, something to do that was compatible with the specific skills they had spent years developing, and those skills were not naturally transferable to the agricultural or commercial economy of coastal North Carolina. Within months of his pardon, Blackbeard was sailing again. The vessel was the Adventure, a sloop, smaller by far than the Queen Anne's Revenge, more modest in her armament, more suitable for the coastal and inlet waters of the Carolina shore. She was fast, she was manageable, and she allowed Blackbeard to operate in a register that was, at least nominally, deniable in a way that a 40-gun flagship never could have been. The operations he conducted from the Adventure during this period were careful, in their fashion. He targeted vessels whose seizure could be justified, at least on paper, through legal mechanisms that the cooperative Governor Eden was apparently willing to provide. There was a process in colonial maritime law called a vice admiralty proceeding, by which captured vessels could be condemned as legitimate prizes if the right paperwork was filed with the right officials. Eden appears to have been willing, on at least one occasion, to provide exactly this service, to officially condemn a vessel that Blackbeard had seized, allowing the proceeds to be distributed through a channel that had the appearance, if not the substance, of legality. It was a remarkable arrangement, and it could not last, for reasons that were becoming increasingly visible from a distance, even if they were not yet fully apparent to the participants. The man who saw it most clearly was Alexander Spotswood. The governor of Virginia was everything that Charles Eden was not, or at least presented himself as such. He was energetic, politically ambitious, and deeply invested in the project of demonstrating to London that the American colonies could govern themselves effectively, which meant, among other things, that they could handle problems like Blackbeard without requiring the dispatch of additional naval resources from Britain. Spotswood had been watching the situation in North Carolina with a particular irritation of a man who believes that a problem within his region is being handled incompetently by someone else. The intelligence reaching him through merchant networks and colonial correspondence painted a picture that he found entirely unacceptable. A notorious pirate captain, formally pardoned, operating out of a neighboring colony with the apparent connivance of that colony's governor, continuing to intercept and seize vessels in waters that affected Virginia's trade. The legal complications were significant. Virginia's jurisdiction did not extend to North Carolina. The pardon that Blackbeard held was genuine. Any action Spotswood took against a man operating under a royal pardon in another colony's territorial waters was going to require very careful legal architecture, and it was going to require the kind of naval capability that existed in Virginia's harbor in the form of two Royal Navy vessels, the Pearl and the Lime, whose commanding officers Spotswood would need to persuade to undertake an operation of questionable legality in waters outside their normal jurisdiction. He persuaded them. The operation he organized in the autumn of 1718 was, in its planning and execution, a considerable piece of work. Two small sloops, smaller vessels better suited to the shallow waters of the Carolina inlets than the naval frigates themselves, were hired and provisioned. They were placed under the command of a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard, a man about whom the historical record has relatively little to say before this moment, and rather a great deal to say immediately afterward. Maynard was given his instructions, his vessels, and a clear objective. He was to locate Blackbeard. He was to offer him the opportunity to surrender, if the law required such an offer. And if Blackbeard declined that opportunity, he was to resolve the situation by whatever means were necessary. He sailed south in November of 1718. Blackbeard, meanwhile, was at Ocracoke. The inlet at Ocracoke, on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, had become something of an informal gathering point for the remaining active pirates of the Atlantic coast. Several captains had established a pattern of meeting there, sharing intelligence, trading supplies, conducting the kind of loose professional association that the remaining pirate networks maintained in the increasingly difficult climate of late 1718. The era was changing around them, visibly and rapidly, and men who were paying attention could feel it. Whether Blackbeard was paying attention in those final weeks is something the record does not definitively resolve. What the record does show is that he was at Ocracoke with the Adventure and a crew of somewhere around 25 men when Maynard's two sloops found him, that he had been warned, by at least one account, that naval vessels were in the area looking for him, and that he chose to remain. This choice, to stay, to anchor in the inlet, to face what was coming rather than run from it, has been interpreted in many ways across the 3 centuries since it was made. Some historians read it as arrogance, the fatal overconfidence of a man who had escaped every previous confrontation and who could not bring himself to believe that this one would be different. Some read it as calculation. The inlet was shallow, and Blackbeard knew its waters well, and he may have believed that his knowledge of the local geography gave him an advantage that offset the numerical disparity. Some read it as exhaustion, as the decision of a man who had been running from the law, from his own legend, from the grinding impossibility of sustaining a life that was built on permanent motion, and who had, on some level, stopped. The truth is probably some mixture of all of these, in proportions that we cannot now recover. What we know is that the night before the battle, the last night of his life, as it would turn out, Blackbeard reportedly drank and entertained aboard the Adventure with his crew, that the sounds of the gathering carried across the water of the inlet in the darkness, that Maynard's men, anchored nearby and waiting for dawn, could hear it. There is something in that image that resists easy interpretation. A man drinking with his crew on the last night of everything, the sounds carrying across still water, the darkness complete around the inlet, and somewhere in that darkness, an ending that he may or may not have fully seen coming, drawing quietly closer with the tide. The shore had not held him. It never really had. The ground had always felt wrong beneath him, too still, too governed by the patient logic of people who had never had to decide anything quickly. The water was where he belonged, and the water, in the morning, was where it would finish. Segment 5, The Morning at Ocracoke. The Last Battle. November the 22nd, 1718. The Outer Banks of North Carolina in November are a particular kind of beautiful. Not the warm, generous beauty of summer coastlines, not the kind that invites and welcomes. The beauty of the Outer Banks in late autumn is harder than that, colder. The light comes in low and flat across the water, turning the surface of the inlets silver and grey, and the wind off the Atlantic has an edge to it that reminds you, if you needed reminding, that the ocean does not care about the calendar or the season or the plans of the men who sail it. It was into this light that Robert Maynard's two sloops moved at dawn. The vessels were the Jane and the Ranger, small, lightly armed, hired rather than commissioned, crewed by naval sailors who were operating a long way from their frigates and a long way from anything that could be described as naval backup. Maynard commanded from the Jane. The Ranger was under the command of a man named Hyde. Between them, they carried somewhere around 60 men, which was a meaningful numerical advantage over the 25 or so aboard the Adventure, and which would matter rather less than the mathematics suggested once the morning got properly underway. The Adventure was anchored in the inlet as Maynard's sloops approached. Blackbeard was awake. Whether he had slept at all that night is something no surviving account specifies, but the picture that emerges from the depositions and contemporary records is of a man who met the morning with full awareness of what it contained. He had positioned the Adventure with characteristic attention to the local geography. The inlet was shallow, and he knew its channels, knew which approaches were navigable, and which would put an unwary keel into the sand. When Maynard's vessels moved toward him, he had options that a navigator unfamiliar with these waters would not have had. He used them. The battle began, as naval engagements of this period typically did, at a distance. Blackbeard opened with his guns. The broadside that the Adventure delivered to the approaching sloops was, by the accounts of the men who survived it, devastating in its immediate effect. The Ranger was hit hard and decisively. Her commander Hyde was killed. Most of her crew were casualties, and she was effectively removed from the engagement in the opening exchange. The Jane fared better, but took significant damage, and the casualties Maynard suffered in those first minutes were severe. What followed was one of those moments in naval history that the documentary record captures with a particular vividness, precisely because the men who survived it were interviewed, deposed, and asked to account for what they had seen in enough detail to give us something close to a continuous narrative. Maynard, assessing his situation after the opening exchange, made a decision that was either tactically brilliant or the only available option, depending on how generously you want to read it. He ordered the bulk of his surviving crew below deck. He wanted the Jane to look, from the Adventure, like a vessel whose crew had been largely destroyed, like a prize that could be boarded with minimal resistance. Blackbeard saw what he wanted to see, or what Maynard intended him to see. The Adventure came alongside. The boarding of the Jane by Blackbeard and his men was the moment at which this engagement transformed from a naval exchange into something considerably more intimate and considerably more brutal. He came over the side himself. This is documented. Multiple surviving accounts place Blackbeard physically aboard the Jane, fighting in the front of his own boarding party, which tells you something essential about the kind of captain he was. Not a man who directed violence from a safe distance, but one who placed himself at the tip of it. Maynard's men came up from below. What followed was close quarters fighting of a type that the early 18th century conducted with a directness that later centuries would find difficult to comprehend. Cutlasses, pistols fired at ranges where you could see the eyes of the man you were firing at. The confined deck of a small sloop, slippery, crowded, loud with the specific sounds of men trying to kill each other as efficiently as possible. Blackbeard fought through it. He fought through it in a manner that the accounts describe with a consistent quality of astonishment, even from men who had presumably seen significant violence in their own right. He was shot. The records indicate he was shot multiple times during the course of the engagement. The precise number varies by account, some placing it as high as 5 gunshot wounds before the end. He sustained sword cuts. He kept fighting. There is a quality to the accounts of Blackbeard's final battle that historical documents do not often possess, a kind of bewildered admiration even from the men who were trying to kill him. The image of a large man, wreathed in the smoke of his own burning fuses, absorbing damage that should have stopped him, moving through the chaos of a contested deck with apparent purpose, is one that the contemporary witnesses found difficult to render in the ordinary language of depositions and official reports. They kept reaching for superlatives that the legal register of such documents did not normally accommodate. He came very close to killing Maynard himself. The accounts placed the two men in direct combat at some point during the fighting, and Maynard was apparently fortunate in the intervention of his crew at a critical moment. It was a sword cut, finally, that ended it. A blow to the neck, delivered in the midst of the fighting, severe enough that even Blackbeard could not continue through it. He went down on the deck of the Jane, and the fighting around him subsided in the way that fights do when the central figure around whom they have organized themselves is suddenly no longer standing. The Battle of Ocracoke Inlet lasted, by most estimates, less than an hour from the first exchange to the end. Maynard had Blackbeard's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of the Jane. This was not savagery for its own sake, though it was savage. It was practical. Spotswood had offered a bounty, and the bounty required proof. There were also the deeper requirements of a moment that everyone present understood to be significant. The need to demonstrate to every remaining pirate captain operating on the Atlantic coast, and to every merchant who had spent years looking at the horizon with something between dread and resignation, that the thing which had seemed unresolvable had been resolved. The adventure was brought back to Virginia. The surviving crew members, some of whom had been below decks during the battle and had not participated in the boarding, a point they made with considerable urgency during their subsequent trials, were tried in Williamsburg. Most were convicted. Most were hanged. The legal proceedings were swift, and the sentences were carried out with the efficiency of an administration that wanted the matter concluded. Governor Spotswood received the credit, and the credit was, on the whole, deserved. He had identified the problem, organized the response, found the right man to execute it, and seen it through to a conclusion that London found entirely satisfactory. Lieutenant Maynard received rather less recognition than his role warranted, which is a pattern in military history that repeats itself with depressing regularity. The man who actually does the dangerous thing receiving less institutional reward than the man who authorized it from a comfortable office in Williamsburg. But history has, across 3 centuries, corrected something of this imbalance, and Maynard's name is attached to the engagement in a way that ensures it will not be entirely forgotten. The news traveled fast by the standards of 1708. It moved through the colonial ports of Virginia and the Carolinas first, then south to the Caribbean, then east across the Atlantic to London, where it was received with the satisfaction of a government that had been receiving increasingly embarrassing dispatches about the state of its authority in American waters. The golden age of piracy was not ended by the death of Blackbeard alone. There were other captains still operating, and the process of dismantling the remaining pirate networks would continue for several more years. But Blackbeard had been, in many ways, the most visible and the most symbolically powerful figure of the era. His death marked something, not quite an ending, but the beginning of an ending, the point at which the trajectory became unmistakable. Within a few years, the major pirate captains who had defined the era were gone. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the age by any measure of prizes taken, was killed in 1722. The haunts that had sheltered these men, Nassau, Tortuga, the Carolina inlets, were brought, gradually and with varying degrees of violence, back under something resembling governmental control. The Atlantic trade routes, which had operated for years under the shadow of flags that belonged to no nation, became measurably safer for the merchant vessels that kept the expanding colonial economy alive. The world that had made Blackbeard possible ceased, by degrees, to exist. But here is what happens with figures of sufficient magnitude. They refuse to remain only historical. They migrate. They move out of the documentary record and into something else, into the imagination of the cultures that come after them, where they are worked and reworked into shapes that say as much about those later cultures as they do about the man himself. Blackbeard became, almost immediately after his death, something larger than the facts that contained him. The details of his life that were documented became the scaffolding for a legend that was under active construction before the decade was out. By the mid-18th century, accounts of his exploits were circulating in popular form on both sides of the Atlantic, and the elements that the legend selected for emphasis are themselves instructive. It selected the theater, the burning fuses, the wild eyes, the enormous dark beard that gave him his name, and that the contemporary accounts describe with consistent attention. A beard that was apparently remarkable enough in his own right to be worth commenting on, braided or tied with ribbons in some accounts, woven with the smoking matches in others. It selected the violence, but in a register that allowed for admiration alongside revulsion. The accounts that circulated in the decades after his death consistently rendered Blackbeard as a figure of extraordinary physical capacity, a man who could absorb what would stop others, who fought to the literal end on the deck of an enemy vessel, who died in a manner that the legend found, on some level, appropriate for what he had been. And it selected, perhaps most persistently, the treasure. The story that Blackbeard had accumulated treasure and hidden it somewhere along the Carolina coast has proven to be one of the most durable elements of the entire legend. It is almost certainly not true. The documentary evidence for any such cache is essentially non-existent, and the economics of piracy in this period suggest that accumulated wealth was typically spent, distributed among crews, and consumed rather than buried for later recovery. Pirates were, as a professional class, generally not well positioned for long-term savings planning, but the treasure story persists because it does something that the historical facts alone cannot do. It keeps the story open. It suggests that something of Blackbeard's world is still out there, still findable, still capable of being recovered by someone who looks in the right place at the right time. And then, in 1996, something was found. Not treasure in the conventional sense, not gold or silver or the accumulated plunder of a decade's raiding, but something that was, in its own way, more significant. A private salvage company working in Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, the very inlet where the Queen Anne's Revenge had grounded in the summer of 1718, discovered the remains of a vessel at the bottom of the water. The artifacts recovered from the site told a story that accumulated specificity and conviction over the years of excavation that followed. Cannons of the right period and type, anchors consistent with a vessel of the Queen Anne's Revenge's size, a bell, navigational instruments, thousands of smaller objects that the careful process of underwater archaeology began to bring up from the silt in which they had rested for nearly 3 centuries. The identification is not absolute in the way that a signed document or a captain's log would make it absolute. The sea is not generous with certainties, but the weight of the evidence, the size of the vessel, the armament, the location, the date of the artifacts, is compelling enough that the site is now officially designated as the Queen Anne's Revenge shipwreck, and the objects recovered from it are held at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort, where they continue to be conserved, studied, and interpreted. She is still there, in other words, beneath the water of the same inlet where she stopped moving in 1718, changed by 3 centuries of immersion, broken and scattered and buried in ways that the years produce in all things, but there, tangible, recoverable, piece by piece, in the patient way that archaeology recovers things. The cannons that could have fired on any vessel in the Western Atlantic, the anchors that held her when Blackbeard chose to stop, the bell that marked time aboard her, through the raids and the storms and the long crossings and the blockade of a city and all the rest of it, still there. There is a quality to the light on the water above a wreck site that is different from the light on open water. It does not look different. You could not identify it from a distance, but if you were there, floating above the place where something significant came to rest, you might feel the difference. Something in the stillness of the water over that particular patch of silt. Something in the way the light moves through it, down through the layers of the column, reaching toward the dark. 300 years of tide have moved across the Queen Anne's Revenge. 300 years of seasons. 300 years of the Atlantic doing what it has always done. Indifferent, powerful, patient beyond any human measure of patience. And beneath all of it, in the dark of the inlet where she stopped, the ship waits to be known. She has time. She always did.